Dear students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. Today we would be learning about national policies. We would be starting, or I would say the learning objectives would be definition, need, hierarchy, and the sectors of the policies. Then we would be studying the policies related to the housing sector, the transport sector, the infrastructure sector, the industrial sector, and the informal sector. To start off with the definition of the policies. Now, as far as the dictionary definition goes, policy is a set of ideas. I'm quoting: policy is a set of ideas or a plan of what to do in particular situations that has been agreed to officially by a group of people, a business organization, government, or a political party. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention has also spoken about and written about the definition of policies, and it is that policy is a law, regulation, procedure, administrative action, incentive, or voluntary practice of governments and other institutions. Policy decisions are frequently reflected in resource allocations. Health can be influenced by policies in many different sectors. Similarly, there are other policies, for example, transportation policies, which can encourage physical activity. There can be policies in schools which can improve the nutritional content of the midday meals. So therefore, there can be different policies which guide either the development or guide various aspects or various sectors. Then we come to the objectives and the process of policy. Now, United Nations Conference on Climate Change 21 said that public policy provides signals and sets the regulatory and institutional framework that influence the actions of all actors, including private investors and other stakeholders. If we look at the chain or the cycle of the process of the policy, we find that, you can see from this figure, we find that there is a problem definition, and then one has to set the agenda, then the policy gets developed or formulated, then it has to be implemented, and then there's an evaluation of the policy. Coming to the hierarchy of policies, we find policies at the international level, then the national level policies, what we were discussing right now, then the state level policies and the local level policies. And the various sectors, as I was mentioning earlier, the various sectors for which there are policies related to the economic sector, the housing sector, the transport sector, infrastructure, then industry, informal sector, tourism, then environment and climate change. So these are the various sectoral policies. So now coming to the housing policy. So we come to the National Urban Housing and Habitat Policy, a very significant policy of 2007, which is now undergoing revision, and a new policy would be framed very soon. So this policy relates to the housing sector. As we know that shelter is a basic human need, next only to food and clothing, and there is a lot of housing shortage which we have. It is estimated to be about 24.7 million housing shortage, and then urban areas, basically our cities, are plagued with unaffordable housing, then therefore with lack of facilities, and as you can see that there is severe shortage of basic services. So that constitutes the rationale for this policy focus on housing and basic services in urban areas. So coming to the focus area of this policy, the focus area is, or the focus of this policy is affordable housing for all with sustainable development. As we know that there's inequity in housing sector in our cities, so that was the basis of the focus area. Coming to the objectives of this policy, there are 4 objectives. The first objective talks about encouraging the state governments, urban local bodies, development authorities to periodically update their master plans and zonal plans, which should inter alia adequately provide for housing and basic services for the urban poor. The second objective speaks about promoting balanced urban and rural planning by following the regional planning approach, taking the whole state or union territory as a region under the Town and Country Planning Acts in the states. The third objective is planning of mass rapid transit systems at the city level for efficient mobility or as a basic service for urban poor, for the mobility of urban poor. Also not only urban poor but for all the residents. Then the fourth objective is about accelerating the pace of development of housing and related infrastructure. Now this policy was formulated by the Ministry of Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation, and as you can see that we have discussed about the need of the policy and the objectives of the policy. Now we come to the transport sector. Transport sector had 2 very important policies. One is the Integrated Transport Policy of 2001, and the second is the National Urban Transport Policy of 2014. There have been many policies, but we are discussing now the significant policies. Now, the focus area of the National Urban Transport Policy of 2014 was to integrate or about integrating land use and transport planning in cities. Now, what are the objectives? Now, the objectives was about incorporating urban transportation as an important parameter at the urban planning stage rather than being a consequential requirement. One has to consider about urban transportation when we plan for our cities, not after we plan and then fulfill it as a requirement. So that's what the first objective explains, or first objective focuses on. The second objective is about ensuring safe, affordable, quick, comfortable, reliable and sustainable access for the growing number of city residents to jobs, education, recreation and such other needs within our cities. It is about facilitating mobility and about how we facilitate mobility by better access through safe modes, then affordable modes, and then it has to be fast. So this is about how we can facilitate mobility in our cities. Now the next objective talks about bringing a more equitable allocation of road space with people rather than vehicles as its main focus. That means the roads are not only for the vehicles, the people have the equal right to use the roads in terms of walking, cycling. So this objective talks about the people's right to the road, not only the vehicles. The next objective talks about enabling the establishment of quality-focused multimodal public transport systems that are well integrated, providing seamless travel across modes. In a city, there are various modes operating. We have the bus, we have the train, we have the rickshaw, we have the taxi, we have various modes operating in a city. But this objective basically talks about the integration. In many cities, we also have the metro, we have the BRTS. So this is talking about the seamless integration of various modes to, again, for convenience, for comfortable and convenient, as a convenient mobility option for the residents. The next objective is about establishing effective regulatory and enforcement mechanisms that allow a level playing field for all operators of transport services and enhanced safety for the transport system. So this as it explains, as it is explained in this, it is about that safety, how we can establish safety and we can have regulatory mechanisms. The last two objectives speaks about speak about introducing intelligent transport systems or ITS for traffic management, which is very essential for any city, of cities of any size class. How do we manage the traffic which is in the city? And the last point is about objective is about reducing pollution levels through changes in traveling practices, better enforcement, stricter norms, technological improvements. As we can see that the air quality levels are worsening day by day. So this objective becomes a very, very pertinent and significant objective which relates or which talks about environmental impacts of traffic movement, that is pollution levels, air pollution levels primarily. So we come down to the next sector, that is the infrastructure sector. We have, as we know, that infrastructure, there is a physical, there's a main component which is the physical infrastructure, and then we have the social infrastructure. And in physical infrastructure, we speak about water, we speak about sanitation, we speak about garbage, and then power. And in the social infrastructure, we have the education aspects, health aspects, recreational aspects, civic facilities, all that. So now we see that the important policies for this sector, if we list out, we find that there was this National Water Policy of 1987, then there is the National Urban Sanitation Policy of 2008, then there is this National Electricity Policy of 2005, National Policy on Education of 1968, and National Policies on Health of 1983. Now we come to the National Water Policy. Now, National Water Policy of 1987 is, what was the need of this policy? Let us see. As we know that the water is one of the most crucial elements in planning, life cannot sustain without water. So therefore, as the cities grow, we find that there need to be efforts to develop, conserve, utilize, and manage this very important resource, and that is the basis on which this policy is rooted. The need for this policy, therefore, is clear. Water is a scarce and a precious national resource to be planned, developed, and conserved as such, and on an integrated and environmentally sound basis, keeping in view the needs of the states concerned. So we now come to the focus area of this policy. The focus area is about drinking water, about irrigation, about hydropower, about navigation, about industrial and other uses. So the focus area of this policy is not restricted to only the city area. It is also talking about the agricultural requirements, about the city requirements, and then also about using water for navigation, then and the other sectors like industrial and other uses. So water is at the national level, how to judiciously utilize and effectively utilize water. That is the purpose of this policy. So the objectives of this policy is about that we have to have a well-developed information system for water-related information. That means how much water is available, what is the groundwater scenario like, and how much of water can be withdrawn, what is the quality of water. So all these similar aspects are what we talk of as water related information. What are the needs or the demands for water. Then the next objective is about practicing non-conventional methods for utilization of water, such as through interbasin transfers, artificial recharge of groundwater, and desalinization of brackish or sea water, as well as traditional water conservation practices like rainwater harvesting, which can be either rooftop harvesting or it can be community level rainwater harvesting structures. So the objectives are this, that we have to look for non-conventional methods of utilizing the water and of conserving this resource. Now we come to the next important policy is about the policy I was stating, that is the National Urban Sanitation Policy. Now this National Urban Sanitation Policy, the focus of this policy is that, or the need of this policy, we find that all Indian cities and towns have to be healthy and livable, and they have to sustain the public health and environmental outcomes for all their citizens, with a special focus on hygienic and affordable sanitation facilities for the urban poor and women. So this is the focus or the purview of this policy. Now, what are the goals of this policy? The goals of this policy is about awareness generation and behavioral change, about open defecation free cities, about integrated citywide sanitation, then about reorienting institutions and mainstreaming sanitation, then about sanitary and safe disposal, proper operation and maintenance of all sanitary installations. After all, health and hygiene depends on proper sanitation, and therefore this sanitation policy becomes a very significant policy for our country, for our cities. Now we come to the power sector. So we have our National Electricity Policy of 2005. As we know that power is we increasingly consume power for various purposes at the city level, beyond the city level, for agricultural purposes, and for various as bulk consumers, power is required. So therefore, the focus area, it aims at, this policy aims at laying the guidelines for accelerated development of the power sector, providing supply of electricity to all areas, protecting the interests of consumers and other stakeholders, keeping in view the availability of energy resources, technology available to exploit these resources, the economics of generation using different resources, and energy security issues. So we have to have power to run machines, to run our cities in order for the city to function, we need power. So therefore, this policy was formulated to guide how power can be effectively utilized and demand can be met. So therefore, we come now to the objectives, that is the access to electricity. The first objective, that it has to be available for all households in the next 5 years, and the availability of power, that the demand has to be fully met, and energy and peaking shortages need to be overcome, and adequate spinning reserve need to be available. The supply of reliable and quality power of specified standards in an efficient manner and at reasonable rates. Many a times power is not affordable, and then we do not have quality power. So one of the main objectives of this policy is about quality and about affordability. Then the next objective is about per capita availability of electricity, how to increase it. So it is stated that per capita availability of electricity to be increased to over 1,000 units. Now, then we come down to the minimum lifeline consumption of 1 unit per household per day as a merit good. So there are targets put up, there are targets fixed as part of this policy. And then the policy also speaks about the financial turnaround and commercial viability of the electricity sector, and also about protection of consumers' interests, because power is actually the lifeline of the country to function, and therefore this policy becomes very important for cities, for the region, and for the country as a whole. Now, next is about the national policy on education. We had a series of policy on education, which is the social, as part of social infrastructure. We had the national policy on education of 1968, followed by national policy on education in 1986, followed by again the national policy on education 1992, and we had the latest policy on education, which is the 2016. It was developed by or formulated by the Ministry of Human Resource Development, and the focus of this proposed new policy, the latest policy on education, is on improving the quality of education and restoring its credibility. It seeks to create conditions to improve the quality of teaching, learning, assessment, and promote transparency in the management of education. People need to be educated in order or so that the country progresses, and therefore this policy becomes very important policy. And the objectives of this policy talks about encompassing 4 essential components, that is about building values, about creating awareness, about generating knowledge, and about developing skills. So all these are required if we really want the nation to progress. Now, the need of this policy is rooted in the criticality of education for social, economic, and political transformation, as I was speaking about. It is about the role of education in inculcating values, then about providing skills and competencies for the citizens, about enabling to contribute to the nation's well-being, about strengthening the democracy by empowering the citizens, about acting as an integrative force in society and fostering social cohesion and national identity. So, coming from this very significant national policies on education, the next sector pertaining to social infrastructure is the health sector, which is again important because the country needs healthy citizens, healthy people, not only healthy citizens, healthy people. So therefore, how do we ensure that? So this national policies on health, as similar to the education policy, there were a series of policies. So there was this National Health Policy of 1983, National Health Policy of 2002, is the National Health Policy of 2017. So these policies now, the need or the focus area of these policies is that it aims at achieving universal health coverage and delivering quality healthcare services to all at affordable cost. Because many a times we see that healthcare becomes unaffordable for a large section of society, and then so therefore the coverage is many a times become very poor. So the aim of this policy is to overcome these problems, and the objective of this policy, National Health Policy of 2017, is to achieve the highest possible level of good health and well-being through a preventive and promotive healthcare orientation in all developmental policies, and to achieve universal access to good quality healthcare services without anyone having to face financial hardship as a consequence. Now, the need of this policy, as I was stating, that healthy people, or health is prime. As we all know, health is wealth, as the saying goes. So the need of this policy is to inform, clarify, strengthen, and prioritize the role of the government in shaping health systems in all its dimensions, that is investment in health, organization and financing of healthcare services, prevention of diseases, and the promotion of good health through cross-sectoral action, access to technologies, developing human resources, encouraging medical pluralism, building knowledge base required for better health, financial protection strategies, and regulation and progressive assurance for health. And the policy emphasizes reorienting and strengthening the public health institutions across the country so as to provide universal access to free drugs, diagnostics, and other essential health care. So they're basically about strengthening the healthcare infrastructure in the country. Then we come to the next sector, that is the industrial sector. So the industrial sector, we have the industrial policy of 2017 is the latest policy, but there have been again a series of policies. We have, to start off with, we have the industrial policy of 1948, followed by the industrial policy of 1991, and the latest one, as I said, the industrial policy of 2017. And it was formulated, industrial policy was formulated by the Ministry of Industry and Commerce. And then we have the focus area of this policy is to set a clear vision for the role of industry and industrial growth in the growth and development of the nation's economy. And the objective was to develop a globally competitive Indian industry with skill and scale through engagement of stakeholders and which would leverage the technology. And it also talks about ensuring that it embeds into itself sectoral objectives and provides an overarching umbrella policy framework. It also speaks about deciding on the time frame for implementation of the policies considering the global and national economic scenarios. Industry is one of the prime drivers of the growth of our country, and therefore this policy becomes very important, which guides that how would this driver be, and what sort of, how would it ensure in driving the nation's economy. Then we come to the next sector, which is the informal sector. Now, informal sector develops or generates because the formal sector or the formal activities, people cannot get absorbed in the formal activities. Then there are demands. The demands are not always met by the formal sector, and therefore informal sector comes up. The policies for this informal sector is the very landmark policy is the national policy on urban street vendors. We know that informal sector contributes to a great extent to the national economy. So this policy on urban street vendors acknowledges that yes, these street vendors also need to be looked at, and their demands need to be looked at. So therefore, the aim of this policy was to ensure that this important occupational group of the urban population finds due recognition at national, state and local levels for its contribution to the society, aims at giving street vendors a legal status. Each street vendors are generally should be registered with the supervision of a town vending committee or TVC, and need to have an identity card with a code number and category, so that at least one knows who are the street vendors and how many of them are there. So the objectives are about providing for and promoting a supportive environment for the vast mass of urban street vendors to carry out their vocation, while at the same time ensuring that their vending activities do not lead to overcrowding and unsanitary conditions in public spaces and streets, because the formal or the street vendors are basically in areas where their business is, and it is mainly in these streets, in squares, or near transport terminals, near malls, near marketplaces, where they can sell their wares. So therefore, at the same time, one needs to allow this activity, but at the same time one has to see that how to overcome the problems which this activity brings in. The specific objectives of this policy is about providing legal status, about providing civic facilities, about transparent regulations, about organizing the vendors, about participative processes, about self-regulations, and about promotional measures. As we said, the town vending committee. So we see that there are, as planners, we need to see that how do we plan for these vending zones? That means zones where these street vendors can be. So therefore, the national policy introduces 3 zonal categories. One is restriction-free vending zones, second is restricted vending zones, and the third is no vending zones. So this can be applied to any city, and we can see that how this vending zones, we can plan for these vending zones and this different typology of vending zones in the planning of cities. Uh, then we see that the national policy has also proposed three measures to manage and organize street vendors, that is promulgating zoning laws for stationary street vendors, because street vendors are either stationary or mobile. So one is the zoning laws for stationary street vendors, then instituting the participatory town vending committees or TVCs, then promising some sort of form of social security measures for the street vendors. So these are the three measures or aspects which the policy has spoken about. Then we have a very important economic activity, that is tourism, which is prevalent in the entire country. So tourism, we have the National Tourism Policy, which is draft. But prior to this, we had again series of policies. We have National Tourism Policy of 1982, followed by the National Tourism Policy of 2002, which has come up with the 7S or guidelines for tourism development in our country. So we come to the next detailing out of this National Tourism Policy of 2015, and the focus area is about employment generation, about community participation, about development of tourism in a sustainable and responsible manner, domestic tourism as a major driver of tourism growth, then emphasizing on technology-enabled development and promotions in established source markets and potential markets, and also developing and positioning India as a must experience and a must revisit destination for global travelers, whilst encouraging Indians to explore their own country. Now, as I was referring to the National Tourism Policy of 2002, we have the 7S or the 7 keys which this policy provided for tourism development. First S was about Swagat, that is welcoming the tourist. Second is about Suraksha, that is providing safety to the tourist. Third is about Safai, that is about cleanliness. Fourth is about Sahyog, that is cooperating with the tourists. Then Samrachna, that is about infrastructure development. There's a lot of tourist infrastructure. We need hotels, we need travel operators, we need various tourist spots to be developed. So there's a lot of tourist infrastructure which needs to be developed. And then the last is Suchna Suvidha. Suchna Suvidha is facilitation, information, communication and facilitation. So these 7 aspects are the keys of the National Tourism Policy of 2002, as I was referring to. So now we come to the very important aspect, which is degrading day by day, is about environment and climate change sector. And we have the National Environmental Policy of 2006, focuses on preventing environmental damage from occurring in the first place, rather than attempting to restore degraded environmental resources. There have been various other policies before this National Environmental Policy, like the forest policy, and then various other policies have been there, but policies relating to various areas like arid areas, then coastal areas, there have been, but this environmental policy is an overarching umbrella policy, which the objectives of which this policy is about conservation of critical environmental resources, about intra-generational equity, that is about livelihood security for the poor, about intergenerational equity, about integration of environmental concerns in economic and social development, about efficiency in environmental resource use, about environmental governance, and about enhancement of resources for environmental conservation. Now, the objectives stated above are to be realized through various strategic interventions by different public authorities at various levels, that is at central level, state level, and local government levels, and would also be the basis of diverse partnerships. And the principles followed in this policy are that human beings should be at the center of sustainable development concerns, and the right to development must be fulfilled so as to equitably meet the developmental and environmental needs of present and future generations. It is about sustainability. We should be the trustees for the future, trust for the succeeding generations or for the future generations. So the present generation as environmental trustees for the future generations. That is the concept, and that is the basis of this policy. So in order to achieve sustainable development, environmental protection constitutes an integral part of the development process and cannot be considered in isolation from it. And where there are credible threats of serious or irreversible damage to key environmental resources, then lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. And in various public actions for environmental conservation, economic efficiency would sought to be realized. So basically, we have to overcome, or we have to see to it that whatever activities we do or we have should have least impact on our resources, and so that we can, and our resources need protection, so that we can use these resources for a long time in future, and that development should not be at cross purposes with environment, but it should be with consonance with an environment. So that this is the premise on which these policies are built. So dear students, today we have learned about the national policies, about the definition, the need, the hierarchy, and the various sectoral policies, starting from housing sector to the transport sector to infrastructure sector to industrial sector, and the informal sector, tourism sector, environment and climate change sector. Now these policies, how does it relate to planning? Policies are the guidelines which a plan needs to follow. And urban planning, these policies, when we plan for our cities, for its development, we need to take care of these policies. Many a times, policies are at conflict, they are conflict with each other. But then putting together these policies into a coherent whole and utilizing and applying these policies into the plan is the challenge which every planner has to face. And because the policies guide various sectors, and which the sectors which are in the cities, so therefore we the knowledge of these policies, or what we learn today, is helpful when we plan our cities. Thank you.